Most people don't realize how much their personal information is being bought and sold every day. Data brokers are making billions, pulling details about you from public records and the internet, and then packaging and selling it, usually without your consent. That's how your information lands in the hands of scammers, spammers, even stalkers. It's why you get endless robocalls and why ads seem to follow you everywhere. That's where Aura comes in. Aura actively removes your data from broker sites and keeps it off. They also instantly alert you if your information shows up in a breach or on the dark web. But Aura goes beyond data protection. With one app, you get a VPN, antivirus, password manager, spam call protection, dark web monitoring, and even up to $5 million in identity theft insurance. All backed by 24/7 US-based fraud support. Other companies might sell just credit monitoring or just a VPN. Aura gives you all of it, together, at the same price competitors charge for just one service. Start your free trial today at aura.com/remove. Protect yourself now at aura.com/remove.
Welcome to the AEW Match Guide podcast, where we deep dive into the best matches in AEW history. Brought to you by the Social Suplex Podcast Network and your host, Sam Brown. Hello and welcome to the AEW Match Guide podcast. I'm your host, Sam Brown. Thank you for joining me. Today, we continue with the fourth season of the Match Guide, where we'll be looking beyond the ropes of Tony Khan's ring to the matches, wrestlers, promotions, and movements that influenced all elite wrestling. If you enjoy the show today, you can subscribe or rate it on your podcast app of choice, support the Social Suplex financially through Red Circle, and make sure you check out all of the other great shows on the Social Suplex Podcast Network, where we cover all aspects of the world of pro wrestling. We've got One Nation Radio, Keeping It Strong Style, All Things Elite, Tunnel Talk, the Trish and Sarah Wrestling Podcast, Wrestle Art with Chris Things, Imps AEW Adventure, and Joshing Around. And you can subscribe to the Social Suplex newsletter at socialsuplex.com/newsletter. Become part of the Social Suplex community by joining our Discord, where you can chat with the hosts of all our podcasts, as well as other wrestling fans from all around the world. Links for all of these things will be in the podcast description. My guest for today is a former columnist for lordsofpain.net and podcaster for the Right Side of the Pond on LOP Radio. It's Maverick, and we are discussing The Shield versus the Wyatt Family from Elimination Chamber 2014. Mav, it's great to have you on the podcast today.
Oh, it's really great to be back. Really enjoyed it last time. I think I'm this sort of go-to person for, all things Moxley and Shield related, it would seem, on your podcast.
Yep. When I was flicking through the Rolodex, when I was looking at the people to reach out to, I was like, who can I go? I've had Imp on, I've had Mizzy on. Who are some of the old heads I can bring back? I've reached out to Steve. He's not returning my calls. I don't know if Plan's still interested in wrestling or not, but, Maverick, he's always interested. He's always keen to talk John Moxley. He's always keen to talk the Shield. Let's do it. Let's book him in. And here we are to talk about a match that, I've got a lot to say about. I know you have a lot to say about, and I hadn't watched it in quite a while, and it was so good to go back to, man. It was like slipping on an old pair of boots. I think I messaged you after I watched the match, and I think I just said, I'm going to watch Shield matches all night now. It's so good to get back into this.
Yeah, they just have so much energy and so much kind of vitality to them. I think, they actually reinvigorated tag team wrestling as a genre and almost invented or reinvented this new genre of sort of six-man tag team wrestling, which had a reputation of being something which was always thrown together and a bit inconsequential. And then they made it a main event art form for a period of time, which is, some feat.
Absolutely. And that's going to be one of the things we're going to talk about today. Of course, there's a lot of things that we can speak about, but particularly in relation to this match, I think, and thinking about this in AEW, of course, we're going to get into the build. We're going to talk about the match itself, but, there's a lot of things. And I think factional booking, talking about trios wrestling, which is something that has become a big thing in AEW, but as you said, the Shield really brought to prominence in the WWE, and there is a certain member of the Shield that would become a bit of a big deal in AEW that you and I like just a little bit, Mav. So it's going to be a big one to get into. We've got a lot of topics to sink our teeth into. Are you ready to go? You ready?
Oh,
You
yes,
ready to
let's
jump
do
in?
it.
Yep, let's jump in. So I think the best place to start would be if we just talk outlining the Shield and the Wyatts and talk about those guys individually. I think anyone listening to this podcast will know the story of the Shield in the WWE. They debut in December 2012, a trio of developmental wrestlers, Dean Ambrose and Seth Rollins, who had previously been on the Indies as John Moxley and Tyler Black. Tyler Black, interestingly, in ROH, former ROH champion, a company promotion now owned by Tony Khan, and Roman Reigns, who is related to some very famous wrestlers that have previously been prominent in the WWE. Bit of a burnout from football, but he comes into wrestling and goes, I'd like to give this a go. It's in my family. It's something I'd like to do. And the three of them are paired together. They debut, of course, wearing all black, claiming to be on a mission to right injustices in the WWE. And when they first show up, it's assisting CM Punk to retain his WWE title against John Cena and Ryback. They're in a three-way match when that happens. And then they would have their first match, a TLC match, defeating Ryback, Daniel Bryan, and Kane at TLC 2012. And then over the next year or so, they would collectively take out pretty much everyone, a who's who of who was in the WWE at the time, guys like Cena, Taker, people who had, it's not just the mid card that's getting run over by the Shield. It's people who are, sort of almost sacred cows in the WWE in the 2010s. The Shield's running over them, which was a very prominent and bold creative thing for them to go with. Mav, you were covering WWE. You were writing about it at the time. I'm not sure if the podcast had started in 2012 or not yet. What did you think of these guys when they debuted and this tear that they went on initially after debuting?
So I was instantly obsessed with them. I had been watching the Dean Ambrose and Seth Rollins feud in FCW because there was, a lot of talk about how good those matches was, and there wasn't an easy way to watch FCW on UK TV at the time, so it was a case of just finding it on YouTube and watching the matches. But I was, sufficiently into those two that, when they arrived, I was very excited. And of course, Reigns made such an instant impression with the Raw and the, execution of that triple powerbomb on Ryback that, I was just straight away, they became instant favorites of mine, purely through that one angle. And I was fully drinking the Kool-Aid from that moment, really. And I think the thing was they nailed the presentation so well. The mysterious handy cam promos backstage, you didn't know where they were, you didn't know what they were doing, you didn't know what their motives were. They'd assisted CM Punk, they insisted they weren't Punk's muscle, they were just doing what was right. They were, the hounds of justice. And the whole build up to that TLC match was just absolutely masterful. And I think what was particularly interesting was the way they were able to showcase the respective strengths of the three wrestlers to make a cohesive whole. Ambrose handled a lot of the mic work in the early days. Reigns was obviously the muscle. Rollins was the, to begin with, the spot monkey was kind of how people were seeing him. But he was obviously the sort of the cleanest technical wrestler of the three of them. And it just blended together really beautifully. And then the fact they went on and booked them incredibly strongly to take down these various Justice Leagues. So I think at the time, we were referring to them in the community as, Justice League 1 was the Kane, Bryan, and Ryback match. And they had, Justice League 2, which I think was Sheamus, Jericho, and Cena. And there was a variety of those sorts of six-man matches going on. And through that kind of summer period, they started genuinely working for the Authority, and that's when sort of things get interesting, because this Wyatt feud comes up at about the point where they're starting to kind of edge away from Triple H and Stephanie, and you get a really nice dynamic there as well as that all starts to work itself out. But yeah, to answer the original question, I was captivated by them completely. It was absolutely my type of pro wrestling.
I think one thing with this is they just absolutely nailed the casting. And even though we, of course, with the benefit of hindsight, can see what these three guys went on to become, even at the time, you've got interesting contrasts between the three of them. But each is like putting forward a compelling case as to like, this is why I can be a future star in this company. Of course, like, as you and I love Ambrose / Moxley. We'll refer to him as Ambrose for now. Just the charisma just leaps off the screen. As you said, he's the mouthpiece. Rollins really dynamic in ring, and Roman Reigns, just you could see just looking at him immediately, like, this is a guy that the WWE could get behind, and he's really well cast in the role that he plays. Obviously, he's still learning on the job a little bit in this, but he's with two guys who are able to help him on the job, help him learn on the job, and he fits that part of being able to be like a silent bruiser and power guy really well, because he looks that way. It's interesting to think, because obviously, like, we know now that this was a stable that was allegedly pitched by CM Punk. There's varying origin stories for the Shield, but allegedly one of them is that CM Punk pitched having Rollins, Ambrose, and Chris Hero. And I love Chris Hero. Chris Hero is great. Like, just this most recent WrestleMania weekend, he had a really fun, like, 5-minute, 8-minute match against a mixed gender match, actually, where he just beat the tar out of this person. And just looked incredible doing it. You like are watching these indie shows, and suddenly Chris Hero shows up, and you're like, oh, this guy is really good still, even though he hasn't wrestled for like 2 years, I think. But I think having Roman Reigns in there instead of Chris Hero, not only does he look the part in a way that I feel like Chris Hero doesn't, but I think it sort of like gives the WWE a bit of ownership of this faction. This is a faction that's not just these three indie guys who've been thrown together. It's these two indie guys who've come in, and one of their sort of franchise guys that they want to get behind as a franchise. And so I think, even from a backstage casting perspective, it gives them a really powerful dynamic to work on, and a really powerful presence, which obviously helped them and sort of legendarily throw their weight around a little bit as a trio. And it's worth mentioning that these guys sort of came together at a time where there was a bit of skepticism around this sort of stable. It's worth reflecting that, a year, 2 years before this team came together, there was a team that sort of came together of new wrestlers who looked very prominent and were booked very strongly for, a couple of months in the Nexus, that is, but were then ultimately cycled down the card very quick and put in their place by John Cena at SummerSlam. Whereas with the Shield, these guys sort of came in, they stuck together, and were able to, and were, I guess, pushed ultimately by the WWE in a way that we hadn't seen for a long, long time, a trio of rookies getting pushed.
Yeah, and I think part of that is talent, because, the Nexus, while the initial presentation of them was very strong, really it boiled down to, Wade Barrett, Daniel Bryan for, the first part of the angle, but then obviously, well, who knows what happened there, really. That again, that's one there's lots of stories around. And the rest of them weren't really up to it. Whereas, and because they were the sort of generic developmental guy, that they just entered out developmental for that show, and none of them were particularly compelling visually or, in the ring. Whereas with this, as you say, they just nailed that fusion of three people with very different strengths that could all at the same time do a bit of everything. And they were all around the same age as well. I think the thing is that, Chris Hero, or, Cassius Ohno, as he was down in developmental at that time, was quite a bit older, and I always seems strange to me as a side point that they didn't do something with him and Claudio / Cesaro, because obviously they'd been a team for a long time, and they did loads with KO and Sami Zayn, who were the same way on the indies. It seems strange they never wanted to do anything with those two, but they promoted Cesaro really early and kind of left Chris Hero down developmental. That was always a little bit strange to me. But I think they got the three right guys for this, and they instantly gelled, I think, and it was just, yeah, it was just brilliant. And they were able to, by their performances, justify their booking. I think that's also important because every single match they had was absolutely fantastic. And, it's easier to justify going over these veterans of the industry when, the results are, as strong as they were.
Absolutely. Yeah, their debut match is an all-time classic. That is one of the, we've seen a lot of plunder brawls, and if you watch AEW, you see even more of them, with the things like Anarchy in the Arena, but that spirit of chaos, which I think we're going to talk about a lot, is just so prominent in that TLC match. And these guys were able to bring that intensity and energy so often to these matches. Let's move on though, because we'll continue to touch on those sorts of topics as we move on and those sorts of themes. And we'll talk about the Wyatt family. So Wyatt family, obviously Bray Wyatt, Luke Harper, and Eric Rowan. They would form with Bray Wyatt as their leader in NXT in mid 2012. Wyatt would feature in various singles feuds, sort of backed up by Luke Harper and Eric Rowan, and Harper and Rowan would form a tag team together, eventually winning that NXT Tag Team Championship. They would debut as a unit on Raw in May 2013, filling like a similar role in terms of Wyatt dropping cryptic promos. His initial feud is with Kane, and he's backed up by the other two, but then those two go on a tag team undefeated run for a little while. They would sort of operate up and down the roster. Am I right in saying, Mav, that they didn't have quite, there was a bit of excitement around them. There's not quite the same level of juice as there is with the Shield when they debuted. But, everyone, I guess, could see the charisma in particular with Bray Wyatt.
I think people were very excited about it because by then NXT had sort of launched on the network, hadn't it? And so there was very much this sort of excitement around the developmental system that hasn't been there before, and a lot more people were watching developmental, I think, than ever have done before. So when they fast tracked him up to the main roster, people already knew what he was about. Maybe not, the more casual section of the fan base, but certainly, sort of switched on fans knew all about them. And the vignettes, I love a good vignette. As a side point, I've been watching New Gen Raw from the beginning. So from the first show in January 93 onwards. And you get to see kind of how they use those vignettes to kind of really support those characters before they debut. And it's so effective. It's still the most effective way to do it. I mean, nowadays it's the guy comes out the curtain and it's like, oh yeah, we all should know who this person is, which works if it's, Chris Jericho, but not so much if it's, somebody that doesn't have that level of sort of name recognition. And I think those vignettes built up this idea of them being a, creepy, Louisiana swamp cult type of deal. It played in a lot of that imagery you get in, say, the first season of True Detective. Had that real sense of, swamps and hidden bodies and, madmen and religious ecstasy. And it was really well presented. And supposedly Dusty Rhodes had a big hand in that character when Wyatt was developing him, because of course he'd had to go as Husky Harris in the NXT in the Nexus before that. And obviously as a as the son of IRS, this is someone that's real pro wrestling pedigree. Mike Rotunda's one of the smartest guys of his era. So you could see that his character work was going to be really interesting, and where they took the characters would be really interesting. And I think that first 18 months of the Wyatt family is the strongest part of it. And they lose it, I think, really, when they start trying to make him a replacement for The Undertaker. Because as soon as you start doing that supernatural stuff with Wyatt, I think it loses its power. It's much more interesting when it's a creepy cult. And I think, the spirit of it in the beginning was they were kidnapping people and brainwashing people and making people see their flaws and their sins, which is why it made such a good counterpoint to the Shield being all about justice. Because on the one hand, you've got kind of physical justice being meted out by a group that see themselves as enforcers, and then you've got, on the other hand, a group that see everybody as hypocrites that need to be brought into the light. And that's a really interesting dynamic, because it's almost two different ways of looking at the same thing. They're both trying to clean out the roster, but with slightly differing motives. But it's like it's in a Venn diagram somewhere. So I think that's why it works so well. And I think the Kane feud's just to get him going. Then you get the initial interactions with Bryan. Then you get the initial interactions with Cena. And it's because of these interactions with Cena that they kind of bump up against the Shields in the way that they end up doing. It's really nice roster positioning, actually.
And these guys are, along with the Shield, sort of part of a first wave of this new blood that's coming through at the time. You've got on the roster at this moment, of course, there's like the real old heads, guys like Kane, who've just been around forever. But then there's also, your Dolph Ziggler's, your Drew McIntyres, who sort of bumbled around a little bit. They've had pushes, they've had starts, not necessarily taken the way that they would have, or not had the backing of Vince McMahon the way you would have hoped. And you've got these new guys coming on who are sort of a new generation. Cody Rhodes is also part of that, I should mention, like that. He was in Legacy, so he was in, a group that debuted, sort of came to prominence came together at the end of 2008 and really had its biggest year in 2009. And then he sort of goes off, and guys like him, Ziggler, McIntyre, Sheamus is another one. They're the guys that will form these Avengers squads that would go up against the Shield. They haven't necessarily been able to get the keys to the castle. And then the Shield and the Wyatts are coming in, and there's a whole group of people that will follow through behind them. But it's very exciting because you're seeing new blood coming in and roster restoration. I'm not actually watching at this moment, I should mention. So this is all happening while I'm not watching. I've since gone back and rewatched it, of course. But it's interesting to see how these six guys coming in gives like this sense of momentum to the roster and sense of refreshment, because they're coming in and they're getting wins, they're building themselves up, and it feels very fresh and exciting.
Yeah, I mean, my colleague on the right side of the pond had a really compelling theory on this, which was that, Cena and Orton in particular were elevated to the main event so young, and obviously Lesnar as well, but he left, basically a year after his push began. But, the elevation of those two to the main event happened when they were, 26 and 24, I think. And that meant that they had such a long time at the top. I mean, not to mention that sort of Triple H and The Undertaker both went on forever. Edge went on forever. So there was effectively, when Ziggler and Sheamus, who I suppose were probably the two that got closest, Miz you could chuck in there as well, but they were bumping up against this glass ceiling all the time, because the guys that they were supposed to be replacing had so much time left. And because the traditional cycle of a main event wrestler is, if like Bret Hart, when he wins the title from Ric Flair, is in his mid-30s. That was your traditional pathway, and yet because Cena and Orton buck that trend, you end up with this sort of lost generation of the Zigglers and the, I know Cody Rhodes obviously get it back in the end, but had to go through quite a lot to get there. Same with McIntyre. But you've got this lost generation that kind of can't get above the upper mid cards really for any length of time. And then the Reigns and Ambrose and Rollins, and shortly afterwards Kevin Owens, they just blast straight through it. And partly it's a question of good timing, and partly it's a question of just having that little bit more get up and go about them. As you say, they were very protective of their position on the roster, and also had, I think, the ear of Triple H, as Triple H's power in the company is increasing creatively as well, which I don't think harmed them any either.
Yeah, the Wyatts and the Shield would come face to face for the first time in 2013, as you said in the lead up, on a random Raw in London. So they kind of just bump into one another. But these sorts of things happen, when you've got, they're involved in different things and they just happen to end up in the ring at the same time. And because they're two factions that have been pushed very, very prominently, the crowd loves it. Like, the crowd goes nuts for it, even though they're not scheduled to face one another at the time. They've not, come into contact with each other previously. The crowd loves this face-off. They go big.
Yeah, it's kind of the big dogs facing up that have accidentally come face to face with each other. At the time, I really didn't like it. I thought it was very cynical. It was like, let's pop there. Everyone knows the London crowd is a real hot crowd. Let's just randomly pop them. I didn't love that at the time. My colleagues who were in attendance at the show absolutely loved it. So, I sort of bowed to their superior wisdom on that, because it apparently it worked in the context of that live show and what was going on around it. But I think it was almost a test, I think, to sort of say, okay, if we put these two groups together, are people going to be into it? And I think obviously they very much were. So I think it was inevitable that they were going to come into contact, and the way they ended up doing it, I think, is very clever.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's talk about that now. So it's ultimately in February of 2013, 2014, I should say, after the Royal Rumble, the Wyatts would ultimately cost the Shield the chance to be in the Elimination Chamber together, with the idea being that the Shield would unite together in the Elimination Chamber, take out the other three members, and then work it out amongst themselves. But the Wyatts cost them the opportunity to do that, which would see them in direct conflict. The Shield would want revenge for the Wyatts for that, It's a very simple build way to build up a match, but very effective, because immediately you're like, I understand why the Shield would like to have revenge for this injustice that's been done to them, where they would have been in, a very strong position to win that world championship.
Yeah, Wyatt is after Cena, and that's why they come in the middle of the match and beat up John Cena. But of course, that cost them the match by DQ. And it's such a hot time for pro wrestling, and seeing the way that everybody thought that Daniel Bryan was being held down by being made to join the Wyatt family. Well, you have that amazing episode of Raw where he turns on them and goes his own way. They have the match at the Rumble, and then Wyatt wins that match, which is a huge rub for him. Brilliant match. Then he chooses Cena as his next target. Obviously, Cena is in that weird position that he was in for a long time, of being, the marquee guy for the company, but at the same time, being very stale. And really working with Wyatt is what begins to bring him out of that stale run that he'd been in. Because obviously everyone loves that Wyatt's targeting Cena, and then you have the Shield that kind of has started to have dissension from about Survivor Series onwards. It's very clever how that each member of the Shield has a moment of prominence. Ambrose in the initial phases, then Reigns from Survivor Series onwards, because he has that amazing Survivor Series performance. He wipes out 4 people all by himself. He then has this jealousy storyline with Dean Ambrose, and there starts to be a lot of dissension between them. And then, of course, the final phase of it is Rollins being the peacemaker, the glue, the architect. And he's the one that has the biggest impact on those matches with Evolution just before their breakup. And of course, it's Rollins that initiates the breakup. So you have this brilliant sort of way of each member having their moment in the sun, so to speak. And this is Reigns' time, but it's clearly there's bickering going on between him and Ambrose from Survivor Series onwards. And so it's almost like they are not as united as they once were, which leaves them very vulnerable to the Wyatts, who, of course, the loyalty of Rowan and Harper is never going to be in question. So there's a lot of intrigue leading into that match. And of course, everyone expects at the time that this was going to be the breakup angle. And I think it was initially slated to be, but I think the reaction to this match is such that they decide to give him that babyface run that ends up being, I think incredibly important to all of their solo careers in different ways.
I watched the promos that came into this, that were in the run up to this match, and you do have like the Shield sort of jockeying between Ambrose and Reigns. They're saying in the wake of being cost the championship, this opportunity at the championship, in how you described, which is a really, just to go back to what you said with, how Wyatt's targeting Cena, but ends up bumping up against the Shield in relation to that. It's a really like interesting or usage of what you guys would always refer to as like shared world booking. These guys all inhabit a shared universe, and it just so happens that they bump up against each other in this way, but it immediately creates conflict, and very effectively and very understandably as well. But you've got in the promos in the lead up to this, straight after that, the Shield are in the ring together, and Ambrose is kind of like, do you think you would have been champion? Looking at Reigns, and Reigns is sort of eyeing him up, thinking, yeah, I probably do think I would have been champion. So you're right. There's like this jockeying between them, who's the top dog here. But you do sort of get the feeling as well that like, oh, these guys will come together at least to fight the Wyatts and feel like they can. And you've got a great line from Ambrose, who just always, like, Dean Ambrose just always has great sign-off lines, like final lines for his promos. He so often nails it, and he goes, if the Wyatts want a new world, we'll give them a new world. Which is just a great line. That's a mic drop one.
There's a great line from Rollins in there as well. It's like, this is our yard and we have intruders.
Yep.
Which is one of my favorite Rollins promos ever.
And then you get some like really great promos from Bray Wyatt and Luke Harper as well. Like, Harper, such an underrated guy on the mic. He says, you reap what you sow. You three boys picked a beautiful hill to die on. And Wyatt says, I'd advise you to be careful inviting the devil into your backyard. He may like it and decide to stay. Which, like, as you've said, like, this is building beautifully on the imagery that's behind the Wyatts. And he's not necessarily saying that he is like this magical devil, but he is saying like, I'm someone who has got like twisted and crazy views, and I'm coming for you. Like, and I'm looking to stay. Like, I'm looking to sit where you don't want me to be. His whole thing, and to be fair to Michael Cole, who isn't always in his modern iteration the most subtle, play-by-play commentator, but Cole would consistently refer to Wyatt's mind games and how all of this was psychological. And of course, sowing dissension within the ranks is exactly what he's sort of intending to do. And of course, that's kind of the story of how this match goes, and then also how the Reigns v Bray match on the Raw afterwards goes, and on the second match between them on Raw. Like, all three of those matches are built around this idea that the Shield's continuity, which has been the way they've run over the whole of the company, is now splintering, and that's why the Wyatts can get in the cracks and really kind of bring them down. Let's get to the match itself. It's because it's a really great match. And I have to say a personal anecdote at the time, as I said, I wasn't actually watching in the times that we've just described, and sort of I've gone back and watched and caught up on since. I was in a hiatus from watching wrestling. I think it's something every one of us has probably done at some time or another. But somehow this news about CM Punk walking out breaks containment, and I go, oh, CM Punk walked out. That's pretty crazy. Like, I really liked CM Punk at the time, and when I had been watching, and I start looking into it a bit, and like, wow, this is really interesting. What's going on? And Daniel Bryan, who I sort of heard legend about, but I had heard that he was getting this push, and he was in an interesting place heading into WrestleMania, and so I was like, okay, let's watch this pay-per-view, Elimination Chamber, and I knew nothing about these 6 guys, but immediately coming into this, the immediate reaction that I had was what was shown in the ring was how the audience reacts to this. It's just immediate eyeballs pop out in terms of like, wow, this looks serious. This looks really interesting, with how the characters immediately show up, and how even just in the initial face-off, there's so much going on. So let's jump into the match. I sort of never left that moment, actually, if I'm honest. Like, it's just, that's been my fandom ever since, just continually coming back to that sort of moment and that sort of reaction and these sorts of characters. But this match, as we always do here on the Match Guide, let's give it its flowers. The Wrestling Observer newsletter rated it 4.25. 4 stars and a quarter from Dave Meltzer. And Cage Match, as of recording, currently has it rated as 9.18. It's the equal highest rated Shield Trios match, along with their debut from TLC 2011. So a match that, for people who love the Shield and for WWE fans at the time, is held in very high regard. I should also mention that it also appears in the book that our friend the Doc Chad Matthews wrote, which is the greatest stories and matches of the WrestleMania era. It's rated at number 34 in that. That's a good book to pick up if you're enjoying what we're putting down and what we're talking about now. So as I said, the Shield, they're the first out. They come through the crowd. It's something that Jon Moxley does to this day, and the Wyatts make their way out. They're a lot more slow. Obviously, their entrance has all of that imagery we talked about. They've got the lamp, there's the lights. The music, though, man, I love how moody it all is. Their theme, I reckon, it's one of the most underrated entrance themes out there.
It's perfectly pitched for them. I mean, equally funny anecdote. We started our podcast in May 2013. So it was kind of this was our sort of real. It was really interesting to talk about it in real time, because it just it was almost that sort of point of like, early 2013. There was still some pretty throwaway pay-per-views that just sort of didn't matter, and then suddenly you could just feel things, the temperature changing as that year went on. And then by the time you get to this point, obviously you're in the build to Mania 30, which is the most sort of fever pitched I think we had been in a long time as sort of fans. And we actually used, as our initial theme music, we did like a kind of a riff on the Shield thing that Joe recorded, that was like, instead of Sierra Hotel India, it was it was like Tango, something out the right side of the pond. That was the initial intro, and then the second intro we had was blowing out the lamp and saying "We're here." So we did a riff on both of these themes as our podcast theme, funnily enough. And
you ended up on "It's Friday" by Rebecca Black.
No, that basically that preceded that bit, you see. So we'd always have we'd have a little kind of call out to a wrestler's entrance, and then it would go into that. It would segue into that. I can't remember the other one we did now. I have to ask the others. There was like, I think you did at least 3 or 4. But yeah, there was, I think, the entrances of both of these groups, I think, is such a key part of their presentation, because of course the Shield were coming through the crowd because they weren't signed wrestlers, right? It's that sort of almost, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash type of thing where it's like they're not meant to be here, so they have to come through the crowd because they shouldn't be backstage. If they were backstage, people would be like trying to get to them. So it's almost like they were fugitives, and they were they'd come and have their match, and then they'd get the hell out of Dodge. And then the Wyatts, it was very much that, the Fireflies, the very southern tinged,
it's like a slow
70s rock, 70s kind of, you could imagine it in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It was exactly the right mood. I think both of those entrances coming up, straight after each other, because they were two of the the big entrances that existed at the time, was incredible to see. And then of course they just them being face to face and the crowd doing the competing "Let's go Wyatt, let's go Shield" chant, it was an incredible reaction for them.
Yep. And in that initial face off that they do when they're in the ring, Dean Ambrose, he's particularly worked up because, as you've said, like, it's been established that Wyatt is kind of in his head a little bit, and he's jaw-jacking with Bray. Bray's calling him out, and what ends up happening is Ambrose just loses it and he just launches himself at Wyatt, and then we get just this brilliant 15, 20 seconds of complete chaos as everything just kicks off, and it's people, there's fists flying everywhere. Wyatt rolls out of the ring but starts just like screaming at the crowd. I'm not normally a fan of WWE's chaotic zoom in, zoom out, cut everywhere, shaky cam style, but in this moment it works. It just feels so chaotic, so visceral, because Ambrose just jumps in and throws a punch, and then it's on for day. Everyone's just throwing punches. There's the crowd is going mental. The announcers are going off. It's just chaos in one, and an adrenaline rush in 20 seconds. And it just sets the scene for this match so well.
Absolutely. And you sort of get this moment of tension where, they're just kind of eyeing each other up. And then once it bursts into flame, it's like the bar brawl. It just, doesn't take much to light the touch paper. And then they're just they're on it. And it's really interesting how they set up those opening minutes. You have like Reigns at the sort of peak of his initial popularity, after that push at the Survivor Series and at the Rumble. And he's powering up Harper into vertical suplexes, and tagging in Ambrose, and he's kind of, as you say, almost like too tightly wound, frenzied. You get that trademark Shield teamwork going in the early stages where they're tagging in frequently, and they're sort of they're working really smoothly. And for a minute you're like, okay, this is just the normal way of the Shield working together has been restored. And then sort of there's this really sudden drop kick from Harper, and then Ambrose is taking an absolute pounding as a face in peril for a period of time. Because it's interesting, because I think most of the Shield matches, you'd have a period where one of them was taking a beating, and quite often it was Rollins, but in this occasion it was Ambrose, but it becomes Rollins a little bit later on. But yeah, it's a great kind of opening salvo, and I think it just doesn't let up. There's not a moment in this match where it isn't just 100 miles an hour.
Things like settle down from that initial rush of just chaos, but and it is a bit more of a standard. There's people tagging in and out. It's a bit more of a standard tag team match, but there's just such an energy to it. I actually watched, because I hadn't watched it for so long, and I hadn't watched any early 2010s WWE for so long. I actually watched some of the lead-up matches that were on this card, things like Jack Swagger versus Big E and the New Age Outlaws versus the Usos. And I can tell you, this match still just stands out like a bright beacon of light with how alive and organic it feels in terms of the way that the combat is and the way that the tagging in and out happens. It's actually, an energy that I now associate with AEW at its best, in like there's no wasted breaths. If they aren't fighting and wrestling, then they're sort of like pointing or jaw jacking or selling. Like there's just no wasted movement, and everything is seemingly intentional or informs something that's going on in the music, in the match. Even like as they're selling, you know, they're like scrapping and clawing, or there's one bit where like Ambrose, it just stood out to me, just it was a random moment. Ambrose like bites Rowan's hand at one point. It's so minor, but it's, you know, in those other matches, there's absolutely nothing like it in terms of how like scrappy it feels almost, and how there's just that energy behind it as things ramp up, and even as it's, you know, more of a standard tag team match in that after that initial burst and in the opening portion of it.
Yeah, and we were kind of moving into a period of time where a lot of the mid to late 90s energy started to kind of come back into the product. You know, that Bryan v Wyatt match from the Royal Rumble as another really good case in point. And you know, ultimately, like there are lots of parts of pro wrestling which I feel like are, you know, becoming somewhat of a lost art, and you know, everybody being completely engaged at all times, regardless of if they're in the ring or not. And that goes if you're you know, a manager or, you know, a commentator or whatever part you are playing, you know, ring announcer, everybody needs to be completely engaged in the fiction. Otherwise it just doesn't hold together in the same way. And I think that's as you say, what's really strong here, and what would kind of see them through this kind of period between, you know, I guess the Punk pipe bomb in, you know, 2011 through to the end of Survivor Series 2016, which was this really good 5-year period for the company and its quality standards. It would be that return of everybody really caring and making you feel like this mattered, which had been lacking through that guest host era that preceded it.
Yeah, well, like, not surprising, the guest host didn't feel like it mattered, because it didn't actually matter to them, because they were there to promote something else, not engage in a wrestling show. But like, you know, I've talked about Ambrose, of course, but you know, like in this match in particular, like Rollins, he's like very polished and precise in his wrestling, but he's still full of adrenaline, like feeding on the adrenaline of this match. And then Reigns, he's like staring daggers through it. And when he gets in there, he's hitting like hard, he's hitting fast. Wyatt's just like so often talking, even when he isn't tagged in, he's just like talking and engaging. You know, and he's like, at one point he just like screams at Rollins and Reigns, "Is this not what you wanted?" You know, it's so... Rowan has his moments, and Harper, like, you have to give a special mention to Harper. You know, the way he sort of mean mugs the hard cam with just the most deranged looking eyes, and the way that his black hair and beard are just wild. And then when he hits, and when he lets off like that drop kick you mentioned, it's like a cannon going off, you know, when he gets that. And at one point he gets a bit of blood in his mouth as well. And it just fits his whole image so well.
Him and Rowan absolutely owns those characters. Like from the beginning, from the very beginning of them having them, they just owned it so well, because it's not easy actually to be, you know, someone that is so obviously a sidekick character. And lots of wrestlers can't do it very well. They were absolutely amazing at it. And obviously, you know, Harper was a brilliant wrestler in his own right. And I think what's interesting is that a lot of people were commenting on how good he was in the ring from the beginning. The fact that he never got a meaningful solo career in WWE is, I think, a massive stain against them, really, because the talent is just glaringly obvious from a character point of view, but also from an in-ring point of view. And there's everyone loved the Gator roll, and he had a move set which was entirely suited to the character of the Wyatt family. I think that's the secret sauce of the Wyatt family, is that all three of them, like, they wrestle like a cult would wrestle. And I think that isn't always something that you see, that actually, if you go back and watch, I don't know, like the Ministry of Dance or something, they just wrestle like Undertaker and Big Show. Right? They don't wrestle like they don't wrestle like I don't know, like the way that the cohesive way you'd expect, like, this kind of brainwashed faction to be wrestling. Like, so I think that stuff like the eyes and the strange noises and the and the sort of the way the rest holds just feel really vicious. That was what made the Wyatts interesting, I think.
Even Rowan doing the like the two fists to the ears move. I can't remember what it's called, but it's like it's like 80s. a very 80s, like, as Sergeant, but the way he pulls it off and like pulls his face when he does it, like, it suits him so down to the bone. It's so perfect for him in that character.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a sort of, there's a sense they kind of end up pummeling Rollins for quite a long time. Like, he has that adrenaline spurt that you mentioned. Like, I mean, pre-knee injury, Seth Rollins was an absolute maniac in the ring. Like, obviously he's still absolutely brilliant, easily the most reliable worker in that entire company. But
incredible athlete.
His athleticism in that sort of initial spurt of his career in the Shields and his early main event career was just bonkers, really. I think Lawler on commentary says that he's like Spider-Man. Which I really like. It's not this sort of late Jerry Lawler randomly now comes out with a good line every now and again. Yeah, Ambrose is literally frothing at the mouth while Rollins gets pummeled. And he has to make a save when sort of they're pinning Rollins, and Harper just comes in, takes Ambrose out, and there's this sense that the Wyatts are just working that little bit more slickly as a team. And like, Reigns has to take on Rowan and Harper by himself because they've taken Ambrose out, and then it breaks down into chaos again. You kind of get it comes back to how it was at the start.
Yeah, sadly, we do get a "We want tables" chant in the middle of this match, which unfortunately is not something that has died out since 2014. I wish it would. I'm just putting that out there, putting that energy out there. "We want tables" chants. They got to go. Don't do that. Don't be at a match when things. Don't be at a show when things like this are happening and start chanting for tables. Just please.
Well, yes, I mean, self-aware crowds are entirely the worst thing in the world, and if you can't be subsumed in the fiction when you're in an arena, then you have no chance, in my opinion.
Yeah. Midway through, sort of as this match sort of starts to really ratchet up, like, Rollins, as we said, he's getting dominated. Reigns gets his first major tag in, and he's sort of hitting these big strikes. But even with all this energy, there is sort of a slowing down that the Wyatts are doing. And as you said, they're sort of working a little bit more slickly as a unit. Reigns is cut off. What? Go on.
It's very 80s, isn't it? Like, there's this, they do this spot where Rowan and Reigns run into each other, which I don't think had been seen in a WWE ring since about 1990. It was just real Warrior and Hogan just running into each other and then being down on the canvas for a while type of spot, which I thought was really interesting. But yeah, it's like Reigns can never quite get the full 5 moves of Doom out. He'll get halfway through his little sequence, which he still does to this day. But he'll get cut off at some point, which I really like. I mean, there are actually some Cena matches that played with that. Like, he'd get 3 moves through the 5 moves and someone to cut him off. He used to do it at Bret Hart as well, actually. Like, it's a really nice sort of play on the fact that, we know what's coming next, but then it gets cut off.
Yeah, you get this awesome moment where, like there's this trio of suicide dives. You know, first you get Ambrose does one, and then Harper does one to the outside, and Rollins does a flip over the top to like sort of set it all off, and that leaves Reigns and Rowan in the ring. And I love how like it just all like really naturally flows, and you know you've then got everyone on the outside except for Reigns and Rowan in the ring, which sort of sets up a really key moment because Rollins then goes to start taking apart the announce table because he's like, I've got to get things back on track for my team. You know, like we need to start going for the kill shot. So he's prepping the announce table for their power bomb. But the Wyatts then team up on him. So they're just able to get this moment where Harper and Bray are able to double team him. Ambrose comes flying in off screen. Like I don't know where he jumped from, but he just comes flying in from off screen and he starts brawling with Wyatt in the crowd, which is take note on that, that those two have gone off in the crowd. And that leaves Rollins and Reigns on equal footing with Harper and Rowan until Wyatt comes back in with Ambrose nowhere in sight. And then
it becomes the big mystery, doesn't it? Like, and they follow this up on the next night on Raw. But I mean, obviously, as the live audience, you're meant to assume that Wyatt has had the better of that interaction. But because the camera doesn't follow it, you don't actually know what's happened to him, and he doesn't come back at all. And obviously, that's what they use to kind of, you know, they have Reigns v Wyatt the next night, and Ambrose is still nowhere to be seen at the beginning of that show, and he arrives right at the end to save Rollins and Reigns, and it's this sort of that ongoing tension that they're creating. But it's a classic sort of spot that obviously if it's the studio they'd have followed it through the crowd, but because they're trying to build this dissension narrative, you're kind of left in the dark as to what's happened. They're left a man down, and you get this sort of big haymaker sequence between Reigns and Rowan where just like throwing bombs at each other, and then you know they double choke slam Rollins through the announce table, so then it is literally just Reigns left with the three of them, and it's a nice little inversion of the Shield putting people through tables, that you know Rollins goes through a table, and it's
also an inversion of how the Shield have been doing business with this divide and conquer strategy.
Absolutely. And you know, because actually if you think about that initial match with Brian, Kane and Ryback, you know, Rollins sacrifices himself with Ryback, you know, and they take out Kane, and then they just left with Brian, they stick him through the table, Ambrose and Reigns. So it's nicely coming back around to those sorts of ideas. And you know, they also Reigns break the Sister Abigail, and they kind of give that false hope spot of actually, you know, he does this kind of Hogan style, he almost hulks up, and then of course because there are three of them, they take him out.
It is actually like, because that's the final stretch, right? Like they take out Ambrose is nowhere to be seen. They're able to momentarily down Reigns, which allows them to triple team on Rollins, put him through the announce table. Then they surround the ring with Reigns in there, as the Shield had been surrounding, you know, hapless other former mid-carders and even upper-carders for 2.5 years. And Reigns, of course, he tries to fight, but he's not able to come up trumps against three of them. Harper, there's an interesting moment where he does go for the Superman punches and the spear, but Harper actually takes the spear. He sacrifices himself for Wyatt, which, as you said, like that so mirrors what the Shield have done, but also like these guys are in a cult. Like him sacrificing himself for the leader is perfect cult-like behavior. You know, as you said, these guys wrestled like they were in a cult.
Absolutely.
Wyatt grabs the Sister Abigail and tries to, and Reigns like nearly breaks it, and the crowd goes nuts on that. It's really hot. Like the crowd wants to see him break it and deliver that win, but he's not able to because there's still, you know, he's outnumbered. So ultimately he gets taken out. Wyatt hits the Sister Abigail and they win. The Wyatt family beat the Shield. And I believe they're the first team to have actually beaten the Shield at this point in a trios match, which is
In a
sort of
trios, yeah.
yeah,
The Usos have a win against them.
yep, and the Rhodes family
and
as
the
well, I
Rhodes,
guess, against Rollins and Reigns.
That's a hilarious match because you've got Ambrose and Dusty like jawing at each other outside the ring.
Incredible, especially because we know how much of a wrestling nerd like John Moxley is.
Yeah,
he is more of a wrestling nerd than anyone listening to this.
Like the bump he takes for Dusty in that match is just absolutely fun. Like Dusty takes the belt off and Ambrose takes this like tremendous bump. Like, great stuff.
My favorite, actually, just while we're talking about it, one of my favorite things is when Jake the Snake returns and takes out Ambrose and puts the snake on him, and you could like see Ambrose trying not to smile and laugh when he's got the snake on him in the ring on that. I think it's like Old School Raw or something like that.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, like such a great ending. There's like, as we've said, like it's so filled with character, with like comeuppance for the Shield, the Wyatts acting as wrestling as a cult, sacrificing themselves, where, you know, the problem for the Shield now is that they've got infighting and they're not sacrificing for one another anymore. They're like butting heads to see who's going to be top dog.
And that's what's great about this era, I think, which at the time, I think people didn't truly appreciate because they were so worried about if Daniel Bryan was going to be in the main event. They couldn't see how good the product was. And what we were infamous for on the ponds was that we all argued that Bryan was in exactly the right place and that it would get to where it needed to get to, and everyone just needed to follow the story. And, you know, smugly, we were right. And it sort of almost took away from the fact that the wrestling was the best it had been, you know, since 2004 or something. You know, it was the beginning of a kind of golden period of, you know, if you liked WWE style pro wrestling, or, you know, with lots of stories and, you know, big matches and moments, like this was what it should look like. And this match and what came after it was a prime example, because it's, you know, it's Wyatt v Reigns, like, and it's almost sort of saying, okay, these are the two leaders, they're going to have a match the next night on Raw, which only fuels that fire of, oh, is this going to be the breakup angle for them? Because Roman Reigns is now having singles matches. You know, they ends up on a DQ because Ambrose runs in to save Reigns and Rollins when it becomes, you know, a numbers game again. But then that leads to another match between them on the Raw the week afterwards, which the Wyatts win again after Rollins walks out because he's fed up of being the glue, which leads to the Shield Summit.
Yep, I was going to mention the Shield Summit.
where Rollins, you know, sort of tells them to get their heads in it. And that then leads to the New Age Outlaws and Kane, and then the babyface run with the Evolution matches, and then Rollins' turn, which then sets up the next 5 years of television.
Yes, pretty much.
So it absolutely just, it's all so well connected, and I know, as you mentioned earlier, the shared universe aspect, which is what all good pro wrestling is based on. You have a well-positioned roster of living, breathing characters that have a history with each other, and the stories write themselves. And that's basically what happens with this crew, you know. And you can throw, Owens, Zayn, Cesaro. Essentially, if you imagine that Survivor Series 2016 match, AJ Styles, you know, you basically have, if you look at that Survivor Series match, that's basically the cast of characters that run those two shows, and when they go for the second split, and it's all being put in place here. So it's a tremendously important match, a tremendously important storyline, and just chef's kiss, really.
Well, look, as I said, like I've said this before, like I came back to watch Daniel Bryan, but I stayed for the Shield. I stayed for Ambrose and Rollins in particular. I was just so captivated by this match. And then, you know, I loved the Wyatt and Cena match at WrestleMania as well, with
great match.
with Cena refusing to take the to attack with the chair, which then you get a really cool echo of 6 months later when Ambrose and Wyatt have that, and Wyatt tries to play that same game again, and Ambrose goes, "No, I think I'll attack you with the chair," actually, and goes at him with the chair. And I loved, obviously, the Shield Evolution stuff was just electric, but then you've got the breakup, and you can see the seeds of the breakup being sowed in these moments here, with Ambrose going off and Rollins having to pull everyone back together and being sick of it. You can see the seeds of that being sowed in this moment, and it germinates in the Shield breakup, which, sets the scene for, as you said, the Rollins and Ambrose massive feud that happened that would dominate the Summers for a number of years, with them feuding against each other, then reuniting. And yeah, it was just so captivating for me at the time. And then, it's popular to really shit on this era of the WWE, the 2010s. And there's some stuff in there that is worthy of derision. Don't get me wrong. As I said, I watched some of the matches that were coming on before this match, and this match really stood out. But there is so much gold in there as well. There's so much gold, and these guys are at the center of most of what is gold in that period.
I would say, if you watch any pay-per-view in any boom period, there'll be matches on there which are absolutely awful. Doesn't matter what company, what era. You can't judge a pay-per-view by its weakest matches, and you can't judge an era by those either, because you're always going to have throwaway matches on a show. WWE between 2011 and 2016 is as good as it ever was for me. If you look at previous times when the product was really good, like the whole of, sort of Survivor Series 96 to, let's say, Survivor Series 98 would be one period like that. Sort of the whole of the year 2000s until, I don't know, let's say the middle of 2002 would be another one. And then SmackDown, but not Raw, in kind of 2003, 2004. And those are all really, really good periods of pro wrestling. I would say that, particularly this 2013 to 2016, it's as good as it ever was for me. I think it's people, if you say 2010s, then I guess if you focus on guest host era 2010, 2011, or dog days of Vince McMahon 2018, 2019, then yeah, I can see where you're coming from. But that whole middle period is absolutely fantastic. And having done a weekly podcast and, well, more than weekly columns through the entirety of it, obviously I was very close to it, and I think being that engaged from a journalistic point of view meant that it probably means quite a sense, and probably explains that when it went sour, that's why I turned off, was because it was so heartbreaking to see everything that they'd gained thrown away. But that period of time, I think, is incredibly strong creatively.
Most people don't realize how much their personal information is being bought and sold every day. Data brokers are making billions pulling details about you from public records and the internet, and then packaging and selling it, usually without your consent. That's how your information lands in the hands of scammers, spammers, even stalkers. It's why you get endless robocalls and why ads seem to follow you everywhere. That's where Aura comes in. Aura actively removes your data from broker sites and keeps it off. They also instantly alert you if your information shows up in a breach or on the dark web. But Aura goes beyond data protection. With one app, you get a VPN, antivirus, password manager, spam call protection, dark web monitoring, and even up to $5 million in identity theft insurance, all backed by 24/7 US-based fraud support. Other companies might sell just credit monitoring or just a VPN. Aura gives you all of it, together, at the same price competitors charge for just one service. Start your free trial today at aura.com/remove. Protect yourself now at aura.com/remove.
This is, of course, an AEW podcast, ultimately, the AEW Match Guide. But I thought it was interesting you mentioned shared universe, and that's when things are at its best. And I think that is such a truism when it comes to AEW as well. When I'm thinking about the start, it was interesting in the really dark, the bad days of AEW. People would sometimes pull up pay-per-view cards or Dynamite cards and go, but look at all these matches. How is it that this time in 2019, when you've got Luchasaurus wrestling, I don't know, Nick Comoroto, for example, like how can we compare these two things and say that the old times are better? And it's because the life that shared wrestling universes brings is just so exciting, and it's so much better when it's that way than when everyone's off in their own silos and in their own universes. Like when I look at early AEW and you've got Chris Jericho and the Inner Circle and the Elite bouncing off against each other, and then throw into the midst of that, you've got Jon Moxley as this sort of lone wolf that starts off by targeting Kenny Omega, and after dealing with Kenny Omega goes for the world title and has this series of things with Chris Jericho in the Inner Circle, but at the same time bounces up against Pac, bounces up against Hangman Page at one point in that period. And then, going into there, even in the COVID years, you've still got this alive nature when you've got the Bucks, FTR, Omega and Hangman Page all sort of bouncing up against each other in the tag team division and other tag teams bouncing off that as well. I just think of how true that is. And then when there was dark days in AEW, so much of it, there was so much horrible backstage stuff, but what that caused on screen was this really disconnected product where it never felt like things were united together. It felt like there was these separate parts, and they would never shall the twain meet. And people were off in their own programs, and they were refusing to work with one another. And as such, it didn't feel like a unified vision. And, if we look at when AEW has sort of consensus-wise gotten back on track and started to warm up again and get better, was 2025 when this Death Riders run that Jon Moxley was on comes up against this trio of faces that you've got with Swerve, Ospreay, and Hangman, and the interactions that they had together, and how the relationship with Hangman and Swerve that had sort of been built up over 2 years of them like hating each other and then sort of coming to terms with one another, at least to a point where they were willing to fight together to beat the Death Riders, and seeing how those relationships start to build up again, and you start to see this spider web of relationships coming out. And that's been particularly strong this year in 2026 with MJF as champion, and seeing how all these people once again are bouncing off against each other, and all these characters are coming through. And what we were, I guess, what the reflection of this is when you've got these characters and they've got this history, and everyone's willing to work together and willing to let those character interactions inform where they're going, it makes wrestling booking so much more simple, right? Like it's like, well, Hangman Page and Swerve Strickland are two faces right now. They're both going up against the Death Riders. So what's going to happen? They're going to have to get through their stuff because to beat the Death Riders. And if they can't, then they're probably not going to beat the Death Riders. It makes these decisions and these creative choices so much more simple, and also so much more engaging as a fan, because you can look at the universe that these people are operating in. You can look at the characters, and you can see and speculate and think about how so-and-so might interact with so-and-so. Like, just to pull a random example that, by the time this podcast goes out might be resolved, but like Andrade's come back and he's sort of made a pact with Don Callis. But Don Callis hasn't actually been able to deliver on this title, on getting him a title shot, and is actually sort of aligned with MJF a little bit, who was the champion until just a week or so ago, and seeing now speculating about, how's this going to play out for Andrade then? What's that going to mean for his character? Because he's sort of been shorted by Don Callis, with Don Callis going up and sort of sidling up to another person.
Yeah, I mean, I watched the Darby
so
Allin,
engaging, and it makes things so simple.
Yeah, I watched the Darby Allin title win, and I think the reason why that Jeff Hardy-esque climb the ladder kids type of, it works so well is because they built that character up, that underdog character who takes a beating and won't stay down. They built that up over, well, more than 5 years now, right?
7.
And so and MJF has been this kind of charismatic bully who thinks he's better than everybody for that entire length of time too. And so seeing him finally get his comeuppance, because he didn't take this guy seriously enough. I mean, it's got it's got all kinds of echoes of, times that happened to Triple H. He wasn't exactly an equivalent character to MJF, but it's not a million miles away in terms of, like, if you think like the idea of somebody liking the finer things in life and, being a heritage style character, like you're waiting for those people to get their comeuppance because they're so obnoxious. And when they do, I think it's all the more impactful. And it's not something you should overdo to have like a kind of massive underdog title win. But if you can limit it, it doesn't half feel satisfying when they pull it off.
Well,
I thought it was a really good angle, I have to say. I thought it was really good. I
agree. The more I've sat with it, the more I've liked it. I was spoiled on it. Unfortunately, I didn't get to watch it in real time, as I never get to watch Dynamite in real time. It's on while I'm working. So I just don't get to do that. And I got spoiled on it, which was frustrating. And I had a different image for how Darby would win his first championship against MJF, because I love seeing Darby getting beaten down as an underdog. And I just had this vision of him having the piss beat out of him for 5-10 minutes and then having one of his epic comebacks, as he often does. But the more I've thought about it, the more I've really liked it. And particularly, they brought in the headlock takeover, which was something that MJF kept on telling Darby Allin he was going to beat him with, that he was so much better than Darby Allin, he could do it with the headlock takeover, which was, a callback to so long ago when they first butted heads in, I think, Full Gear 2021 it was. And you had Sting coming in and Darby, saying, it's showtime, and Sting going, no, mate, it's your time. Like, that's, and paying off that relationship and the sort of mentorship that Sting has given Darby Allin over the years, but him ultimately saying, like, I've got nothing left to teach you. Like, it's you now. Like, I've got nothing left to teach you. And there was so many things that went into that, and including in it, the fact that he's just come out of this hellacious match with Kenny Omega. And I've no doubt that by the time we're talking about this, we're going to see how all of the permeations that were going in the lead up to that, with Speedball Mike Bailey, sort of being frustrated and wanting the title shot against Kenny Omega if he won, and how that's going to play out, and with Kenny, and in that same episode, of course, Will Ospreay and Kenny Omega being in the trainers' rooms, having lost their championship matches, and questioning, like, have we still got it, and then having to pump each other up. So yeah, we can. I guess the point is us, fanning out over this. It shows how when you've got these characters bouncing up against one another, as was happening with the Shield, particularly for the longest time, and also in this match with the Wyatts, it's so effective and so simple. And we've seen that in AEW for the best, and also we've seen when AEW is at its worst is when everything is most disconnected. And obviously there were other things going into it at the time around backstage issues that were just so frustrating and became the story, unfortunately, rather than what was happening in ring being the story.
Or sometimes it can just be as simple as, as stuff being overbooked, right? What is overbooking 100%. Other than, not following the story that's laid out in front of you and doing something for the sake of doing something, right? I mean, there's a, prominent example in, recent WWE television, like, Randy Orton and Cody Rhodes writes itself, right? It's a 20-year story, probably more than 20-year story, because Bob Orton and Dusty Rhodes were friends. It's a story which was so easy to execute, and they completely bungled it because they tried to do something else with it. And it just that's the warning. It's you don't hire a room full of writers, right? You have bookers and agents that can do this stuff, and everything else is just filling in the gaps. And any serious pro wrestling product doesn't get typed out on a PC, or God forbid by an AI bot. Like some of the stuff sometimes does feel like it has been. It's a result of living, breathing characters that inhabit the same space, have a history with each other, and all of their interactions are based on that history as it has developed over time. And that is how it works best, and sometimes still does work that well. And at other times, when the product is less compelling to watch, it's because it's either being tortuously overthought, or there are other motives at play.
Yep. Mav, you very succinctly summed up there what I was blabbering on for hundreds of words to to say, as is usual. You very succinctly summed that up. Let's talk about some of the performers that were in this match, because when we're reflecting on the legacy of this match, it's impossible to get past, some of what would happen afterwards, in the, now 13 years since that match happened. What would come to pass for them. So the first person I want to bring up is Luke Harper. So I've talked about him a few times on this show. We've covered his two biggest AEW matches in depth. Even in the ring, like if we look at this match with the Wyatts, even in a ring with, the star power of Reigns, Rollins, and Ambrose, and also the charisma of Bray Wyatt, like this man shone in this match like a light. And I think it's fair to say that, his time in the WWE was sort of mixed. He would reflect on that as well when he left WWE. And I'm so glad that he had the run that he had in AEW, where he got to show how undeniably powerful he was, and how he was a legitimate top of the card act when he was slotted into that role in AEW. I would argue that AEW and Tony Khan has never booked a big man better than he booked Brody Lee.
I think the gimmick was a hindrance to him. I
100%. Yep.
Now, if you want a deep cut, the match with Dolph Ziggler,
100%.
From I think TLC 14.
Yep, they had it's a ladder match. It's incredible.
Yeah,
I wrote about it when Brody Lee passed. I did a playlist of matches for Brody Lee, and that was on it.
That match is unreal. And I think there's very few more underrated performers actually than Dolph Ziggler. I feel like he's treated very unfairly by a lot of people, because essentially I don't think he was ever in a bad match in his entire career. Like, he's ludicrously consistent. Anyway, that's a side point. Yeah, I think that match shows that he could be an upper mid card attraction for sure in WWE. But I think the gimmick and the temptation to reunite him with Bray every time Bray was back at the scene was probably too much. And unless you've done like a real breakaway story where he was deprogrammed and became, I don't know, like cut his hair and shaved his beard or something, it became like something completely different. I think potentially that was his limiting factor in WWE. But yeah, I mean, I think it's the point of AEW to me as a upstart promotion, albeit one backed by a very rich man. But the point of it is to give opportunities to people that would not have had those opportunities otherwise. Because essentially, if you are like the number 2 US promotion, then I think you have a moral obligation to showcase something a bit different, which I think by and large they've done well. And I think that's a prime example. It's like, if you're going to take people from WWE, like, don't take Chris Jericho, although I understand the name value there, and to a sort of early, an early kind of promotion. It does get some eyeballs on you, but take a guy like Luke Harper, Brody Lee, and give him the showcase that he wouldn't have got in a bigger promotion with lots of competing interests. That's an ideal use of their pay-per-view time to me, is to actually sort of shine a light on somebody like that. And I'm sure there are other examples as well of people that haven't had opportunities elsewhere that they've gained there and have, benefited from the fact that AEW is a bit more open-minded about giving people an opportunity and sharing, kind of upper mid-card spots around.
Yeah, well, I mean, with Brody Lee, he wasn't even upper mid-card in AEW. He had championship program with John Moxley, and then the program with Cody Rhodes was also billed as a sort of a main event program when it was happening with him winning the TNT title. I guess that is an upper mid card belt, so maybe it is upper mid card. But AEW has notoriously been poor. Tony Khan is not good at booking big men. It's just not his strength as a booker. Every booker has strengths and weaknesses, and one of his weaknesses is he just doesn't seem to be able to book big men. But I think Brody Lee, just the charisma that he showed in his role as Mr. Brody Lee, I will always remember when he squashed Cody Rhodes, him just yelling at Arn Anderson, "You made me," and the way he stood over the whole Nightmare family was incredible. And even just the opening promos that he did, where he was channeling, there was definitely some veiled shots at Vince McMahon in the initial promos with Brody Lee, with people coughing and him telling them off for that. But there was also some him aping some stuff that had happened with David Miscavige, the head of Scientology, who'd had some leaked tapes come out of him, going off at his subordinates, and they sort of aped some of those sorts of things as well with Brody Lee, which I thought was interesting. At one point, I was actually saying that they should recruit, when they were looking to recruit Colt Cabana, I was like, they should make Colt Cabana the Tom Cruise of this group, and just have them secretly behind the scenes make Colt Cabana a champion, and Colt Cabana doesn't even realize. He's just like, oh, isn't this great? Aren't these people amazing? But behind them, they're doing all these dirty deeds to make Colt Cabana the champion. Obviously, they never went down that road, and it was probably better that Brody Lee won that TNT championship rather than Colt Cabana. But I really like the idea of that.
It's a good through road as well. I mean, making him kind of, part of that kind of cult's appeal. It's a nice through road between the two characters.
Yeah, but obviously, he's wearing suits rather than a raggedy thing. Yeah,
a different way to do it. I mean, it's kind of almost what they tried to kind of do that in NXT with Joe Gacy, didn't they? It was that sort of similar kind of suit wearing. I mean, Joe Gacy was really just a suit wearing Bray Wyatt when you think about it. But yeah.
I say, but I've never watched a Joe Gacy segment in my life.
I
don't
feel
know, to be honest.
I feel like that character had a lot of potential, but then they just chucked him in the Wyatt Six, and it's kind of he never got a chance to do his own thing on the main roster, which I think was a bit of a shame, because I think the guy does have some talent, but just kind of wasted now, as are many.
It does. That does segue into that. It's very sad to note that Bray Wyatt passed away way before he should have. Whenever someone passes away that's that young, it is an absolute tragedy. And obviously he never did anything, had never had anything to do with AEW. He's someone who was so well respected across the industry and loved across the industry, across all locker rooms by the seams of it, and definitely left a unique legacy in the WWE. And he had such a unique charisma that I don't think they ever really worked out how to completely fit it in the WWE. You could almost argue that this is, by all means, go ahead and do it, because I'd say you could almost argue that this match against the Shield, and this match against Cena, and then the match that comes up with Cena, that's almost the peak of his career. And after, even through the program with Cena, he sort of started to struggle to work out where he fit amongst everything. And certainly after the Cena feud, he had a really good feud with, I thought, with Dean Ambrose, but it was he was starting to verge off into sorts of the realms of the supernatural, which I don't think suited him as well. And after that, he was constantly being rebooted or repackaged in different ways, and it just didn't end up fitting the way that it should have for someone who is so undeniably charismatic.
I think the problem with him was that they gave him too much control. Most of these ideas that didn't pan out so well were his own ideas. And because if you watch all of the tribute shows, I felt like almost universally they were praising the wrong thing about him. You know, they weren't praising his ability in the ring, which was considerable. They weren't praising the intensity of his performance. It kept coming back to his creativity. Like, he was the most creative person. And the thing is that, you know, even if you think about the most creative people that have been in pro wrestling, they've always been tempered by a Pat Patterson or, like, you know, somebody that knows how to make it work on the ground. And I think almost uniquely for that period of time, they gave Bray Wyatt complete control of that character, to the point where it veered well away from what it was at this time that we've just discussed. I'm trying to remember. I think basically the time where I just thought, right, this is totally off the rails now, was there was going to be this match between Finn Balor and Sister Abigail, with Bray Wyatt playing Sister Abigail,
with the
and it never happened
man.
in the end. Yeah, it never happened in the end, which is, you know, a mercy for everybody. But it was, me and Maz were doing the Ponds that week, I remember, and we were just commenting on this old lady voice that Bray Wyatt was putting on. And it was ludicrous. It was completely ludicrous. But they also had, you know, in his program with The Undertaker, which was, you know, and absolutely, I thought the match with The Undertaker at WrestleMania is absolutely fantastic. I think that was really, really well done. But in that program, there was a lot of this competing lightning bolts and The Undertaker burning Bray Wyatt's chair, and, you know, it just got really silly. Stuff that would have been fine in 1994, but definitely not now. And as soon as you try and make him that Undertaker Kane replacement, rather than the David Koresh, the cult leader, the, you know, follow the buzzards, Mary's little lamb, as soon as you do that, you know, I think you're in trouble. And there's a lot of stuff. I mean, Randy Orton shouldn't be winning a Royal Rumble in 2017. That should never be a world title match. Randy Orton burning down the Wyatt cabin and doing these pose in front of it. Like, there's just lots of missteps there and lots of inconsistencies with the character. I feel like the Firefly Funhouse stuff, that part of it, I thought was really, really well done. It's the Fiend bit that's the wrong bit of that. I'd rather him have wrestled as the creepy kids TV presenter, for the Fiend to be kind of something that comes out while he's wrestling, as opposed to the whole, you know, wearing the mask and the glove and doing the mandible claw and, you know, that appalling Hell in a Cell match with Seth Rollins, which is all in a red light and you can't see anything. You know, there's lots of missteps there. You know, I do quite, as a guilty pleasure, enjoy the Firefly Funhouse match with John Cena at the COVID WrestleMania. That is hilarious, and I think, you know, given the circumstances, really quite well done, and it's quite a nice retrospective on the Bray Wyatt and John Cena like arc. But yeah, essentially, like, you know, they just couldn't quite. They tried to do the supernatural stuff, and they kept giving him a lot of control without much of a, you know, a guide. And I guess if Dusty was his guide in those initial days, and obviously Dusty has been passed for a few years by then. So I think that was the issue for me, was that A, too much creative control, and B, a veering off into the supernatural rather than the creepy.
Yeah, I've sometimes called it some wrestlers need an editor. And
yeah,
I think
100%.
Cody Rhodes is one of those, I think. He has
John sometimes one of those, I think.
Yeah, sometimes, yep. Kenny Omega as well is someone who desperately needs someone to push him a certain way to be the man that is the actual star, left to his own devices, I feel like Kenny Omega sometimes will not end up in good places, which is wild for someone who is like, so obviously talented. But, if it's for Bray Wyatt, it's also for Kenny Omega. Like, these really creative people who do push boundaries, sometimes they need someone to steer them in like, no, this is what we need you to do to be not commercially palatable, but just create art in a way that's going to suit the broder context that we're doing within this promotion, and where we need you to fit in this promotion. Because what you're doing is, it's creative, but sometimes those creative instincts need to just be tempered somewhat.
Yeah, because what he did was it stopped him from actually wrestling. It's like he was, if you watch that Daniel Bryan match back, particularly Daniel Bryan match back, like, or even if you watch some Husky Harris matches back, like, the guy was a freak. Like, you're talking about someone that's nearly 300 pounds, built like a real old school pro wrestler before everybody was a gym rat, flying around the ring. I mean, JBL's line about him when he was Husky Harris was that he was a Sherman tank with a Ferrari engine. Like, and the way that he would hit that, hit those cross bodies, hit those, those uppercuts, like, tremendously athletic, really aesthetically pleasing and convincing pro wrestler that was capable of having really good matches. And the more that he did the supernatural stuff, it's almost like he did the Undertaker's career in reverse, right? The less supernatural the Undertaker got, the better his matches got. And then you get that kind of golden era of Taker between, I don't know, like 2007 and 2012 maybe, where he is just basically ignores the gimmick and just wrestles in the way that, in a way that's aesthetically pleasing. And I think, Wyatt almost did it the other way around, that he got more supernatural, and so his matches got a lot worse as his career kind of went on. So, I mean, all those Fiend ones are basically unwatchable. I did enjoy the Alexa Bliss stuff because I like Alexa Bliss. But again, it wasn't going anywhere. It was kind of,
and once that hit the ring at WrestleMania, it was just like the black goo from her face, and it was just it was abysmal.
Yeah.
I did not like that before. I did not like the Alexa Bliss stuff, to be honest. Like, it felt gross to me if I like when I was watching it.
I mean, I always think, like, yes, he should have followers, and he's kind of bringing people in, and so that aspect of it was promising, because it's kind of like, okay, this is what the character was to begin with. He's bringing people into his orbit, but they never quite hit on the right formula when they did with Harper and Rowan. Even when they bring Strowman in, like, it's a bit like bringing Crush into Demolition. It's not the same.
Let's talk the Shield, because it's someone that we've just spent a lot of time talking about the Wyatts. Man, if we could talk about the Wyatts for that long, the Shield, there's someone that we might need to brew another cup of tea for before we get into those guys. But
for sure, I mean, there's so much that you could say. I think ultimately what we came down on the ponds when we did our Shield retrospective, we did a reunion show and we did a Shield retrospective, and I think basically the most important thing to say is that they're arguably the three most influential pro wrestlers of the last 20 years.
Yep. Yeah.
And their multiple achievements as main event talents. Dean Ambrose is a main event talent in two companies. Obviously, Rollins and Reigns have become that kind of, Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels would never go anywhere else type of thing. I mean, obviously Bret did in the end, but only because he was forced to. It's that sort of way in which you can still see the influence that they exert over each other, even at a distance. Moxley does curb stomps from time to time, like
only in important matches though, which, like, even just that, he only does it in important matches. That says something, right? Like,
absolutely. Like you'll see, Rollins does I think Rollins does does the old double arm DDT in a match
Yeah.
At some point. Like there's just these little, these little callbacks, and they still talk about it in interviews, even though that's very rare. They still talk about Dean Ambrose on WWE TV. When they talk about Reigns and Rollins and their time in the Shield, they will say Dean Ambrose. They haven't ever airbrushed him out of existence because, of
Nope.
course, that would be very difficult to do. So, yeah, that is, I think, an amazing legacy to have left, to be that really dominant three-man team, and then for all three of them to be, an unqualified success, and to be incredibly influential on the next generation as well. Lots of people coming into indie rings right now will have grown up with the Chills.
It's funny that you mentioned how they, even still have an influence on each other, or you can see the shades. I always thought the absolute best case scenario for it was never going to happen, right? But the best case scenario for someone to go up against Roman Reigns, the boss of the bloodline, was like some sort of blue collar scrapper who'd come from nothing and who was just like so full of, piss and vinegar and wanted to work hard and do it all himself. John Moxley. I thought the way that their characters contrasted, this guy who's so obsessed with the legacy of his family, his own status, his own sense of authority, against someone who does not care a lick about any of that stuff and is just so full of fire. I thought they would have been the perfect opponents for one another at that moment.
Well, and of course,
and obviously it was never going to happen, but
I mean, you never got that match in WWE either, right? Because they were both career faces, and Reigns didn't turn heel until long after Moxley had left. So you got Seth v Roman on a couple of incredibly memorable occasions, like brilliant matches. Especially, it was kind of post Seth's knee injury, really, really good matches. You got Seth and Dean's incredible, multi-layered 18-month feud. You got the Shield reunions. You got the different Shield tag teams. I think all configurations of the tag team tagged together. What you never got was Roman Reigns versus Dean Ambrose. That
they
is
had one match. They had one match at Survivor Series 2015.
Match. Yeah. And that's it. That's it. And yeah, it's that's the missing thing, that a heel Reigns versus a face Ambrose, or even vice versa. Like, the current version of Moxley up against face Reigns, would be would be something to see. So yeah, it's. I mean, the other thing is obviously the big WrestleMania, Cody Rhodes finishing the story with Seth Rollins' help. Seth coming through the crowd in his Shield gear to distract. And when that Shield music hit, I 100% thought it was 100% thought it was Dean Ambrose for a minute, just for a crazy second. But even that, it's like the Shield past is, it was there in last year's WrestleMania Triple Threat as well. Reigns and Rollins going at each other. That will always be there. Rollins' betrayal, even when they teamed up again, it hangs over them. It's always there. Like, it's never going away. And
you mentioned it's funny. You mentioned earlier how these guys sort of really brought the trios match to prominence in the WWE. And you also said that they were potentially the three most influential wrestlers of their generation. And I would say, I would agree with you, but I would say there's probably another three who are also as influential, if not more. And they also did a lot for trios wrestling, and that's the Elite, Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks. And you talk about a Forbidden Door match that I would eat up like catnip myself. The Shield versus the Elite would just be the ultimate for me. I think I would probably peace out from wrestling if I ever got that.
Well,
it's never going to get better.
It's come out now, hasn't it? That when Endeavor bought WWE, that Tony Khan was one of the other bidders.
Yep.
I mean, you know, can you imagine it? It might very well have happened. And
or in 2018, do you remember when the Triple H and Stephanie McMahon randomly said, "We're not the authority anymore. You guys, the authority. We're going to give you what we got." They thought they had the elite. They thought they were going to recruit the elite to the WWE, and they thought they were in the bag. And that would have probably been one of the programs because, you know, in 2018, who had just reunited, the Shield had just reunited. That was probably going to be something that they were going to do in 2019. But
and I guess they thought
Tony Khan swooped in.
Yeah, I mean, given that they had Styles and Balor, I guess they thought they had a pretty good chance.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But yeah, you know, I mean, as we sit here in, you know, April 2026, it probably would have been better for the, you know, for the world if Tony Khan had managed to buy WWE. I think it would have been a lot better for everybody concerned. You know, given how TKO are going at the moment. Yeah, but it's one of those things. Like I feel like it's almost inevitable. I just have that feeling that, you know, it's one of those things in wrestling, which is a real never say never. I feel like you will see, you know, Jon Moxley have a wrestling match with one or both of those two again. I just feel like that's an itch you'll have to scratch at some point.
Yeah.
Whether it's them coming over that way or him coming over the other way, like I feel like it will happen at some point.
Well, I mean, there's been all sorts of weird talk around Roman Reigns' contract recently in the dirt sheets. I'm not sure what to believe, and, you know, you never know who's laying false tracks for who at this point, because there's a whole lot of stuff being done by TKO in particular to try and discredit the wrestling media, because ultimately they're fascists, and that's what a fascist does. They try and discredit the media, and the wrestling media does a pretty good job discrediting itself at the best of times. So it's an interesting place, but, you know, you never know. Maybe we'll get Joe Anoa'i coming in and wrestling with Jon Moxley, and then we can just hope for Tyler Black to come across as well to complete the trio.
It's probably
we'll see what happens.
It is probably what the industry needs, right? Is that, you know, if you think about like what happened in 1996, like that, you know, that was what the industry needed. It needed it needed one big thing to shake it up, because actually that, you know, that one forbidden door moment of, you know, of Scott Hall showing up on the Nitro set, you know, if that doesn't happen, well, you never get Stone Cold either, because that those spots don't open up for him. You know, so it's like, while it was a huge win for WCW to get Hall and Nash, actually what them two leaving did was open up a spot for another main event talent, and that ends up being Austin. You know, the timing of it all works out pretty much exactly. So, you know, sometimes that's what having competition does, actually, is it makes everything more interesting. You know, when you genuinely have competition, that's what the industry is lacked, is, you know, actually that, well, maybe Roman Reigns is going to jump ship. Like, you know, wow, that would be the most impactful thing to happen in terms of that since then, probably. You know, it would, well, probably certainly since Jericho in 2000, right?
Even beyond just the business, I think it's good for wrestling creatively for people to be moving between promotions and getting fresh licks of paint. You know, we saw it we spoke with Cody Rhodes half an hour ago about Luke Harper to Brody Lee. He's about the perfect example, right? Like he had to go somewhere else so that he could come back as a bigger space. Jon Moxley as well. Like, we loved Jon Moxley in the Shield and in the WWE through the 2010s, but he has himself admitted, like he has said, he got frustrated and he was over it, and he needed a lick of paint. And, you know, the results for him, like refreshing himself and moving over to AEW, are undeniable. He's pretty much become the most important wrestler that they ever signed. You know, at this point, he is undoubtedly a foundational pillar, and to this day is still doing some of his best work. You know, we've seen other wrestlers go across and go back and forth to the benefit. Tony Storm, for example, came over to, she was frustrated in WWE. He's come across and done amazing stuff. You mentioned Cody Rhodes. There'll be people who'll go over to WWE and do some of their best work because they've been able to get a different lick of paint. You know, another example, a bit lower on the card, but Ethan Page, absolute glass ceiling in AEW. He was never going to get anywhere. He's been able to go over and he's carved out like a niche for himself in NXT as, this kind of almost player coach top guy in NXT. And he's doing really well there. It's good for there to be this back and forth between the promotions, even if I don't think AEW will ever compete numbers wise with WWE, because WWE's revenue base is just so gigantic. They're just such a bigger company in terms of the TV deals they've got and those sorts of things. But if they can creatively compete, I think it's fantastic for the wrestling ecosystem for that to happen and for there to being that creative jockeying between the two companies.
No, I totally agree. And I think the thing is that what AEW is really getting right is actually the fan engagement and the fan experience. I looked up out of curiosity, because I was, obviously read all the stuff about ticket prices for WrestleMania being absurdly high, ticket prices for Raw and SmackDown being absurdly high, and I looked up what was the cheapest ticket, for the Wembley Stadium show, right? Yeah. It's like 52 quid.
Mate, by the time that thing runs, you'll be able to get it in for a tenner, I reckon, because they'll be trying. They'll be going hell for leather to try and fill it up as much as possible and have as few as possible red seats showing.
But I think that just shows you what was the cheapest ticket for WrestleMania was probably
it was
500
absurd.
quid, right?
Absurd. Yeah.
So I think that is a really important aspect of it is if you can treat your audience, as a valuable part of the show, I think that goes a long way.
And offer something different as well, which I think is something that AEW is doing without a doubt. Offering a different view on pro wrestling, a different take on it.
I think they're in a from what I can see, looking from a distance, they're in a good swing of things.
Yep.
Creatively at the moment, and really, to attract new fans, that's kind of all you have to do is make somebody watch a Twitter video and go, "Oh, that's interesting. I'll check that out." That's all you need to do.
Mav, we have talked a lot. I've really enjoyed going down memory lane with this one, though. Look, it's a match I will always, always, always treasure for so many reasons, and it's a hell of a match as well. And talking about Jon Moxley, my favorite wrestler of all time at this point, I'll never get sick of it. And so thank you for coming on and indulging me in those things. Thank you for saying yes. I'll have to find something else to talk about you with in 6 months' time or something.
Oh, no,
I really appreciate having you on, mate.
No, absolute pleasure. This was a very special time for me, kind of, when I was in the wrestling media and, reporting this stuff pretty much, day to day. So nice to go back through it, and as I say, real creative boom period, and something I'll always enjoy going back and revisiting.
I don't know if you want people to find you. Do you want people to find? Normally I say if you want people to find you, where can they find you? But I don't know if you actually want people to reach out to you or anything at this point in your life.
I'm not currently writing or recording anything wrestling related, but you can find me on Twitter at LOP Maverick if you would like to. Obviously that platform is toxic sewage, so I can understand if you don't want to, but if I do start writing again, I'll let you know and you can stick me in the description.
100%. Look, you can always write for the Social Suplex newsletter if you want. There'll always be space for you there. We've got a lot of the old LOP heads have migrated over to Social Suplex, so there'll always be space for you if you feel the itch. We'll indulge you. But yeah, as I said, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure. And thank you for everyone for listening. If you have enjoyed what you've heard today, you can reach out to me. You can find me on the Social Suplex Discord. That's the best place to find me. I do not brave Twitter. I jump on once a fortnight to say I've posted a new podcast, and then I literally delete the app from my phone because I don't want to even tempt myself with the dopamine hits from Twitter these days. But yeah, you can find me on the Social Suplex Discord, which is a really good place to chat wrestling if you do enjoy it. Come in and talk about the Shield with me in the AEW Match Guide section. I'd love to have more Shield discussion. If you enjoyed what they became and what they were as much as I did, then feel free to jump in and speak to me about that. And if you've enjoyed the show today as well, we'd love it if you could rate it 5 stars. You can also support the podcast network financially through Red Circle. You can do that either by a once-off donation or a regular donation. And that just goes to keeping the lights on here, paying for things, like domain hosting, like podcast hosting, and all of it is so much appreciated. But even if you've just enjoyed it today, I just love having this platform to talk about AEW, to talk about great pro wrestling matches. And I've got another one coming up in 2 weeks' time. We're going to be talking Magnum TA versus Tully Blanchard. This is going to be the first match from the 80s that we've ever covered, actually. And there's a lot of interesting things to talk about with Magnum TA versus Tully Blanchard. Things like cage matches, like blowing off a feud, like violence in pro wrestling, and also how much Magnum TA looks like Hangman Page. So make sure you come along in 2 weeks' time for all that chat. But look, I really appreciate it, once again, Mav. It's been great having you on, and I appreciate everyone who's stuck around with us and who's listened today, and I will see you again in 2 weeks' time. Bye. Thanks for listening to the AEW Match Guide podcast. If you enjoyed the show, then you can subscribe on the podcast app of your choice so you never miss an episode. Also, feel free to let me know on Twitter at @Sir_Samuel. I'd love to hear from you. The AEW Match Guide podcast is brought to you by the Social Suplex Podcast Network, where you can find many other fantastic podcasts discussing not just AEW, but all parts of the world of professional wrestling. Looking forward to seeing you again next week. I'm Sam Brown.
Most people don't realize how much their personal information is being bought and sold every day. Data brokers are making billions, pulling details about you from public records and the internet, and then packaging and selling it, usually without your consent. That's how your information lands in the hands of scammers, spammers, even stalkers. It's why you get endless robocalls and why ads seem to follow you everywhere. That's where Aura comes in. Aura actively removes your data from broker sites and keeps it off. They also instantly alert you if your information shows up in a breach or on the dark web. But Aura goes beyond data protection. With one app, you get a VPN, antivirus, password manager, spam call protection, dark web monitoring, and even up to $5 million in identity theft insurance. All backed by 24/7 US-based fraud support. Other companies might sell just credit monitoring or just a VPN. Aura gives you all of it, together, at the same price competitors charge for just one service. Start your free trial today at aura.com/remove. Protect yourself now at aura.com/remove.